Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Royal Statistical Society and UK Data Services Starting a Career in Data panel. I'll get through this real quick so we can go straight to our panel of experts. I don't know, Liam, do you want to talk about the RSS stuff?
Yes, sure. So I'm Liam. I'm also here as the Royal Statistical Society's Merseyside Local Group Secretary. So just to say, we host 3 or 4 events a year with speakers on various hot topics in data science and statistics. We're planning another event online in a few months that is yet to be announced. And we've got more events later in the year planned on Bayesian real-time modelling and cybersecurity. And if we just hop to the next slide, Joe. Yeah, you can find out more about us on the New Look RSS website at that URL, or you can find us listed under the local group section or on Twitter at RSS Merseyside. And finally, the Royal Statistical Society membership gets you a variety of benefits, including access to events, training, opportunities, discounts. Registration is also open at the moment for the annual conference, which is projected to be held in person in Manchester in September. And submission deadline for contributed talks and posters is April the 6th, which is quite soon. And that's all I'm going to say for now.
Cool, thanks, Liam. Okay, hello everybody. My name is Joseph Allen. I am a research associate with the UK Data Service. The UK Data Service is the UK's largest collection of social, economic, census data, all sorts of stuff. So you can find out more at the UK Data Service Twitter or at the website ukdataservice.ac.uk, and feel free to follow me on Twitter, ask me any questions relating to any of that stuff too. For this event, we'll be discussing your audience asked questions. So we've collected those from Twitter, from signups over the last few weeks, but you can still ask those questions now. If you go to sly.do/173, I'm just typing that in the YouTube chat as well. So feel free to click on there if you do have any questions. You'll also be able to see the questions that are coming up and upvote other people's questions demographically. And we have the panel. We have Dr. Liam Briley, we have Dr. Kerry Parker and Fiona Pye, but I'll leave the introductions to them. And at the end, I'll share this link again, but I do have a feedback survey that I would love for somebody to fill in. But that's all. So I'm done sharing, and we can jump into the first question, which is just going to be introduce yourselves. So I don't know who should start. Liam, would you like to start introducing yourselves?
Sure. So I'm Dr. Liam Briley. I'm a epidemiologist and a statistician. I'm currently a research fellow at the University of Liverpool. Broadly, I'm interested in how we can better capture genetic and ecological data in order to understand how and why new viruses jump from animals to humans, which is a very topical question at the moment. I've also spent 2 years full-time in a teaching post as a lecturer in statistics, and as an RSS statistical ambassador, I've worked with The Guardian and Panorama in trying to make sense of some data surrounding current issues.
Wow, so you're definitely exhausted of the COVID questions, I imagine. Hopefully there won't be many of them. Cool. And Kerry, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, sure. So I'm Dr. Kerry Parker, and I work as a data scientist. But my background is actually in physics. So I studied chemistry and physics in my undergrad and went on to do a PhD in particle physics. And I moved into the data world in industry in around 2017 and worked for a small company initially and moved to Kerry last year.
Very cool. Yeah, a very familiar trend for data science types is sort of moving through academia, through various routes, and then finding a way into software. So yeah, very cool to hear. And then Fiona, would you like to introduce yourself as well?
Yeah, thanks, Joe. Hi, I'm Fiona. So I'm a data analyst for WSP, which is a global civil engineering consultancy. We work on projects that we love to hate, like HS2. So I did my bachelor's in geology, and then I did a master's in paleontology. This is where I got into software and programming and data. Basically learned a lot of my skills, sort of applying them to projects in that context. And I started my role at WSP literally like a year ago. It was January last year, so I've been in data science for a year.
Nice, good timing as well.
I just about made it.
Yeah, so very, very broad background there, which is no surprise for the way data science sort of has come into existence and where all these jobs are just appearing out of nowhere. So let's jump into the first question. So from Anonymous, I have, data science is said to be a blend of mathematics, statistics, and coding. Can you provide a roadmap for a beginner who is trying to get into that field? So that's a very big question. And as we said before, we could talk about this for an hour if we needed to. I'm going to try and limit it to like 10 minutes, but is anyone sort of burning to describe a roadmap or any suggestions they would have for some newer data scientists trying to get into the field?
I would say probably like don't look at it as like a really big picture thing, because you'll kind of get overwhelmed. Like pick something small that you're interested in and kind of focus on it. So, you know, what are you interested in? Find somewhere that you can try and kind of apply something, like a problem you can solve for yourself or in your role in university, and kind of build from there. I think projects are always a good starting place. You can get a feel for what you like and what you don't like that way as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think I'd also add as well that there's a lot of courses and resources out there, and as Fiona said, it can be very overwhelming knowing where to start. But I think just find a topic that you want to learn a little bit more about, whether that be some kind of statistical methods or programming language. Just kind of start somewhere, and then, as Fiona said, you can quickly focus what you've learned on a project, and once you work through that, you'll kind of realize the parts that you don't quite understand and can go back at those points and kind of focus on learning those rather than jumping in and trying to learn everything at once.
Yeah, I'd also add there, yeah, there's a lot to learn, but the sooner you can start thinking like a data scientist, the better. And I think all the learning is almost kind of secondary to the way that you think. So it's not just about your ability to code or do maths, but it's about, you know, quantitative critical thinking. And that's really important because as a data scientist, you're going to face issues about biases and data quality, things like uncertainty. I mean, we're even seeing things like that have a big impact now. You know, with the AstraZeneca vaccine, there's been roughly about 27 incidences of blood clots, and that's generating a lot of interest and concern among stakeholders and the public. But a data scientist would question, okay, well, how many instances of blood clots would we have expected among that number of people in the general population anyway? So to me, it's far more important to kind of learn that critical thinking than the maths and the coding. That kind of comes secondary.
We've had a great social experiment called COVID-19, but it's been terrible in many other ways. So just to recap what we've really heard there is this, the phrase that was coming to my mind is, you know, it's as wide and deep as the ocean. You can go to like some little puddle called natural language processing and dedicate your entire life to natural language processing, and then somebody else will come around the corner talking about deep learning and you'll have absolutely no idea what they're talking about unless you are just generally interested in those kind of things. And that can obviously be exhausting, but you know, if any other job said, you know, we just want someone who does software, it doesn't really work like that. We have people that have 10 years Python experience that might not be qualified for a senior position programming in R or something like that. So it's understandingly overwhelming, and I think everyone here has said something like the word overwhelming, so it's not surprising. And if anyone watching this is feeling that kind of stuff, don't worry, that's definitely a normal part of the world of data science, especially as it's only been a career for sort of the last 10 years and it's only been a field for maybe 20. Cool. Anyone want to add anything else to that, or shall we move on?
Just one final thing, I'd say, like, you know, coming to events like this sort of is a really good start. Like, there's tons of groups out there and they do lots of like introductions to particular things. So I think going and seeing what other people are doing, they often give you like examples and like resources to work from. And then there's often someone there available that you can ask questions to as well. Like, rather than starting like feeling like you're on your own, kind of get involved with the community and see what's going on, because people are really supportive and you can kind of cover a broader range of stuff that way than you could if you just sat there and went from nothing on your own.
And there's a lot of sort of foundational stuff, as Liam's saying, you know, there's sort of a mental framework of interrogating data and expecting data to exist and knowing what data does and doesn't exist. But then beyond that, it's really this like ambitious part of your mind that needs to say like, oh, can I extract all of my data from WhatsApp? Can I build a word cloud? You know, these aren't the things that normal people are thinking about. I think personally it's only through exposure to, as Fiona's saying, like through the community and through these strange blog posts or people you meet, that you see the stuff that is possible, and in a lot of cases is quite easy from a time perspective. Or there's web tools that do stuff for you, and it's just you would never think to look for them initially. It is definitely exposing yourself to that industry or those people. Cool. I think that's a pretty good answer. Let's move on to the next question. There are so many computer programming languages like Python, R, Java, Go, C, and so on. Which one or some of them is or are recommended to learn? Very good question. I think to start with, should we just say, I mean, does everyone have a preferred programming language and why? And then maybe we can dig into how we came around to those and what we would recommend.
Someone else want to go first?
Yeah, Kerry, do you want to go first?
So my preferred programming language is Python. And I guess my experience before Python was I learned C and C++ when I was at university, mainly by doing rather than any official courses or anything, and kind of taking parts of other people's code to try and understand what they did and applying them to my own problems. And I didn't really enjoy coding very much at that point. And then when I discovered Python and what you can do with it, it just something clicked. And I think just having that foundation of any programming language helps you then apply it to a new one. So I think Python and R are used very often in data science, but I don't think that it really matters where you start. I think just find a language that you'd like to learn, that maybe there's a course you see, and then you can go from there, really.
Yeah. Fiona or Liam, anything to add?
To add one to the list, so I also really like Python and R. Again, I think it depends on what your purpose is. To add to that, I currently work mainly with SQL, which is a structured query language, so it's for working with databases. I think this is also, in ways, I feel like it's often not seen as like the flashy one, but I feel like every data science job, or not every, but a lot of data science jobs actually require this. And when I came out of university, that's the one I was lacking, that all the jobs asked for. So that's something to not forget about, really.
So that's really interesting to me to hear from an academic perspective, because SQL is not something that I really ever use. So I was gonna say, from my perspective, I use pretty much exclusively R, and that's kind of a force of habit. Although that also says I've never felt the need to switch to something else. I think Python and R are probably the most common things that you'll find in data science, and choosing between the two of them is not a huge deal. Something that is growing more and more now as well is Julia, which is quite similar to R in the capabilities for what it can do. It's quite good at statistical modeling and visualization, but it's often faster. So I think at this point I'd probably recommend either Python or R first, but it's good to be aware of newer languages like Julia.
Yeah, and as Kerry said, whichever one you do learn, you'll basically reach a point where you'll apply for a job and they might say, oh, we use Julia here, you're now going to use Julia, and it's often not a disadvantage if you haven't used Julia before. You just have to be this, if you say I'm willing to learn or I'm excited to learn Julia, I only know Python and R, it's very rare that you'll be looked down on, and if you are looked down on in that regard, it'll be because it's a more senior position or a leadership role, or maybe it's a sign that place might not be a good place to work anyway, because they don't believe that you can teach yourself something, which in the sort of world of data and software is a big no-no. So yeah, personally, I would say Python is very good for industry. R is very sort of favored in academia, and they tend to have parity on a lot of things, but in a more like software engineering side, Python seems to lean a bit stronger, but they're always competing with each other. They're always trying to have feature parity with each other. Cool. Okay, next one is, what is the difference between data science and data analytics? My students asked me this question today. Maybe I'll throw in there, what's the difference between data engineering and statistics as well? So data science, data analytics, data engineering and statistics, if you can speak to any of those. I'm gonna write them in the chat as well.
I feel like that's it's very broad. I feel like it's also very, it's interpreted different ways by lots of different people and different companies. So what is called a data scientist in one company may be called a data analyst in another. And then I always think of data science as like the overarching term that like captures all of this. But within that, you do have these like kind of specific roles. Again, don't like take anything as gospel, like look at what the job descriptions are asking for in terms of that responsibility. I think that's probably more important than the title. But I always imagine engineering to be like back-end stuff, so collecting data, transforming it, making it ready for analytics. And I'd say probably analytics is like interpretation, visualization. Between a data scientist and like a data analytics in the, like, so I'm a data analyst, but I don't consider myself to do analytics. So I think there's loads of jargon, confusion there. What was the other question?
Statistics as well. So what's the difference between statistics and data science? Don't have to have an
Liam,
answer.
I feel like you
Yeah, so it's funny because I've got the other side of the coin here, really, because data engineering, data analytics are not really terms that you tend to hear very much in a university environment, but what's the difference between data science and statistics is a massively contentious question, and you know the old joke is it's about £20,000 a year in salary or something like that. But I would say that a kind of common sort of theme between what data science and statistics are, I think it was Leo Bryman who kind of had this observation that in statistics you have essentially a stochastic data model. So you have a particular function that generates data and you're trying to understand whether what you're seeing matches that, whereas data science is a lot more algorithmic. So you're not really bothered about the process that generates the data, you're just interested in knowing what happens next. So really it comes down to a question of statistics has more of the flavor of can we find evidence for relationships, and data science has more of the flavor of can we predict what's going to happen in the future. But those two questions are not exclusive to the other.
Yeah, I think it's definitely a symptom that, you know, most hiring managers at the moment don't necessarily know what data science is. So they're probably Googling what is data science, or a HR team is Googling what is data science and trying to grab things from there and trying to simplify what is, as we've said, this sort of big wide ocean of different things. So yeah, I think it's no surprise that there's a confusion between what these things are. And my personal perspective is everyone's sort of entitled to their own definition of data science at the moment until everybody sort of solidifies on something. You can be a data scientist if you want to. That's my perspective. We do have a follow-up question from the one before. So Liam, you mentioned that you do not use SQL. How do you manipulate large amounts of data? Do you use Spark R, or anything like that?
Usually I just use R. I do, so the kinds of big data that I deal with probably isn't considered big by industry standard. I also use a lot of APIs and repositories, so I let the big repositories do their thing. So I use a lot of R packages to interface, for example, with large repositories of scientific publications, large repositories of genetic information, and that's kind of had a lot already done to it for the kinds of functions that I think you might need to do SQL to your data and the equivalent in industry.
I mean, like I could be wrong, but I thought that SQL is for talking to databases directly. I don't know if you can use it in abstract from that. So if you're not directly communicating with the database, then if you have piles of data in like CSVs or something, then you will manipulate it in things like R and Python. Whereas SQL is like processing data inside the database itself, moving data inside the database. And like I kind of had the same experience as Liam. When I was in university, we always used R. We downloaded data from databases, but we never actually queried those databases directly. So that's possibly to do with it.
I think it's linked with that, as we said before. There's these differences between jobs, and it's very rare that you'll go into a job and they'll say, okay, what should we use to access data from this? Normally you're sort of told, oh, here's the database we've had for 15 years. We use this SQL or no SQL, or we have a team that will export data for you. And it's kind of a symptom of data science being this new field, that they're sort of these internal consultants normally, like squirming around the industry trying to get the data so they can do the parts they do want to do. And sometimes that means that those very tech savvy people will just do it themselves if they can. If what would be a blocker for non-technical people, like, oh, we can only get this with SQL, for data scientists is normally, oh, we can only get this with SQL. Well, I'll go learn SQL. I'll go spend 2 weeks learning SQL and 2 weeks writing what might be a simple procedure, but that's kind of the hustling side of data science, I suppose.
One thing, sorry, go on, Kerry.
I was just going to add there that you can also run your SQL query in Python as well. So you could pull the data straight from SQL into a data frame and do all of your manipulation and cleaning transformations within Python. So you might want to just aggregate some data, or even just pull the raw data as is from your SQL database and then do everything in Python, rather than do any calculations or advanced things in SQL just to get started.
Like another thing to add is that within R and Python there are already like some SQL type logic that's been added with packages. So I think Pandas has it in Python, and the tidyverse in R. They use lots of functions that are based on SQL logic for the manipulation of large amounts of data as well. So that functionality does kind of exist in all these places.
There's another question for you, Fiona, on SQL. Sounds like you didn't use it much in academia. How did you go about learning this for the job? Were you expected to learn it before the job, or did they support you?
So in my master's, I did like half a day at most, maybe 3 hours of SQL as like a demonstration. So I was vaguely aware of it. And then I kind of realized that it was something that was a gap in my CV once I started applying for jobs. There are some resources online, like where people have kind of got these like web databases that you can kind of practice writing queries in. So I studied a little bit with this, and then basically had to convince them in the interview that I was capable of learning, because they asked me loads of technical questions like, what's the difference between a left join and an inner join? I had revised it, but I'd never used it, so I didn't have a clue. Completely failed on all the like technical competency and conversation. And there was an SQL exam in my interview, and I was allowed to Google, so I was literally Googling it, and that's how I got the job. I was convinced I could learn, and I could Google how to actually write the queries. So it is just, showing somebody that you have learnt different languages and that you are capable. And I think, so I just kind of learnt it on the job, asking questions, and seeing other people's code in work. I've kind of built it up from there, really.
Yeah, I think you get really good at learning how to Google questions. I think it's a skill that, all of us quickly pick up when you are struggling to answer a question, and you Google, like the first time you do it, you Google, maybe you just copy and paste the error that comes out of your code, and you'll get some Stack Overflow. Someone has asked exactly the same question, but the answer to theirs doesn't solve your problem. I think you really, really quickly get used to Googling your problems, and the best thing to actually Google. It's an underrated skill.
Yeah, but knowing the keywords is the secret. And like understanding an answer that isn't your situation, but seeing that there's a snippet in there that will help you. It's kind of seeing through that. It's just practice.
Yeah, all sounds very familiar. I think in early academia you're sort of pressured with all this like, don't plagiarize and don't Google anything and don't do this, and then it seems like as soon as you get to sort of a level of independence or industry or writing a master's or something, suddenly Google becomes this like amazing friend, and Stack Overflow is a meme within the software engineering industry, at least.
Yeah, I felt like I made it the day I answered a Stack Overflow question where I had the answer and no one else had written it.
I know people that put their Stack Overflow scores on their CV as like an extra section at the bottom. So it has its value, but there's a long investment to get to that point.
And just a final point there, if you're going to do that, definitely attribute your code and credit the people who've solved the bits that you wanted to solve.
Cool. Next one, as a data analyst, so I guess aimed at Fiona, what kind of tasks do you undertake on a daily basis?
So again, like a data analyst could also mean absolutely anything. But for my particular role, we organise reporting. Reporting again means like a million things in my job. That confused me really early on. But basically, we collect data. So we have clients who say we want to answer these questions, usually for like operational purposes to do with like planning applications. So basically, they describe what data they need, and then I write code to extract and manipulate that data from the database for them. And we create like kind of dashboards and like online reports, and I also help write lots of letters, so like legal notices. So when you get a letter, it's got your name and address and specific details about you. That's because it's all in a database, and we essentially say we want to send all these people these letters, and we join it up to templates and just put the data into those letters. So that's like the most part of my role.
So I think you said before as well, the analytics side is normally concerned with the past and maybe the present. And then, as Liam said, as you get into machine learning, it's more about using that to predict the future. So it sounds quite familiar, and reporting sounds very familiar as well from my analytics days. Cool. Next one, and our most highest upvoted question at the moment: how would you lay out a data science CV? So we've got obviously a slight divide here between academia and industry, but we're not really making those assumptions that you're all going to go into industry anyway. So yeah, what looks good on a sort of data science-y or statistics CV, and how would you feel the gap that most people in this YouTube will have at the moment, that they don't have any employment history? What can they sort of do to stand out from the other people with no employment history?
So
That's a very tricky question.
go ahead, Kerry.
I guess if you're doing, but I think one thing is like if you are doing projects, you can set up something like a GitHub account, or if you're writing about your experience as you're learning, you might have a Medium account. I think adding those kind of links can be quite valuable to add on your CV. So whilst you might not necessarily have had the experience within a role before, the potential employer can click through and see what you've been doing and how you've been learning independently.
Liam, did you have something? Or
Yeah, I was going to say, if you've got no professional experience, that's fine, because I'm sure there'll be a lot of relevant examples from your course or your degree or your training to date where you've had to deal with or handle some kind of data project, right? That's relevant experience. And if you feel that you don't have sufficient experience in that kind of area, then you can get a ton of additional experience by engaging with an online data science community like Kaggle or Tidy Tuesday. Usually they have some really interesting data sets or problems, and it can be a really good network and resource. Similar for any experience you might have with hackathons or R or Python local groups or equivalent events. And if you can commit to it, there's even some kind of intensive online summer schools that would give you that practical data experience to put on a CV.
Yeah, just to add, so at the start of my CV, because I don't come from a conventional background with data science, I have a little summary. I think this divides opinion, but I have a little summary where I sort of try and tell the story of like why I want to be a data scientist. Because if you read my CV, it's like paleontology stuff, and it doesn't like necessarily look directly applicable. But like half of my CV currently is projects I did and applications from university, and the other half is like actual work. But when I applied, I didn't have any real data science work experience either. So like that's really normal, especially coming out of university. One thing that I also have is like a skills section where I name kind of software and like programming languages that I have used kind of as a little, I use these, Python or SQL for example, and then further down, in the experience, I've actually put an example of like something I did with it. So it's not only like name dropping it in like a flash, like I can do this, but you're also like kind of demonstrating it, if that makes sense.
I think there's so many soft skills that are so adjacent to data science as well that whatever your background is, you can kind of spin it in a way that makes you sound like you'd be a good data scientist. So if you're a good people person, that's good because you're going to have to liaise with multiple teams to get access to certain data. If you're a sort of databasey SQL type person, you've got that data engineering side. It's all about how you frame it. I transitioned in from web development, and it was quite easy to sort of say, you know, I've got all these programming skills. They might not be Python. I've never coded Python before, but you know, if we need a dashboard, I've done it before. If we need this, you know, there's all these different things. And then obviously, hopefully most of you have got coursework, or you can do an online course on, you know, learn SQL in 6 hours or whatever. Any of this stuff, if you can like show some code that you've written personally, for me, that puts you above. You'd be surprised how many people don't have any code publicly available. Or maybe you wouldn't be surprised now as you're hearing this, but it's very common that people will apply with no code, and then that requires that interviewers have to test your coding ability somehow, and it kind of makes that process more difficult. So you can sort of do them favors if you can showcase that in a good way as well. And yeah, we mentioned GitHub. That might not be intuitive to anybody. So GitHub is just a place where you can publicly host some of your code and visualizations of that code and all sorts of stuff. But it's sort of an industry standard for how people share code. So it's a good idea to showcase yourself there if you can.
I think one more thing to add about CVs is get feedback on them from other people as well. Like, I think, like, potentially reach out and find a mentor of someone within the industry who I'm sure would be happy to take a look at your CV. And I think tailor what you include on your CV based on job adverts. So if they're saying that, I guess like there are big overlaps between different roles, but if they do highlight certain skills that you'll be using, then kind of try and highlight those on your CV so they're easy to the employer to see.
Ooh. Next one is, what are the biggest challenges you face at work? Very generic question, but I feel like there'll be a lot of overlap in a weird way, as there normally is in data science complaints. Yeah, anyone got any burning complaints about their current job?
I mean, well, I'll go ahead first because I kind of have said a little bit about this in the chat already. But I mean, for me, probably the biggest challenge is data gaps in the data that I use. So, because I'm interested in finding useful biological information from everything we know about mammal viruses, that's actually only a tiny fraction of a description of all the viruses that exist on this planet. So it's really difficult to know if the things that we're inferring from that data are real, or they're only just reflecting what we've sampled. So I think that kind of highlights a broader point that, you know, real world data is messy, and that transition when you've gone from training or your degree, where you tend to work on only kind of nice, neat, toy, clean data sets, to actual real world data can be really jarring for some people. And I think it helps to get out of that mindset that there's one right way of unlocking the story in a data set. You know, there's one right analytical method to use. Because the reality is, you know, there's probably a lot of different things that could do that job. And it's a real skill that we probably don't talk about enough as to making those judgments to say, actually, this is good enough for the task that I wanted to do.
Yeah, sounds very familiar.
I think for me, so one really, really boring thing that no one's ever interested in is getting people who aren't into data to kind of respect GDPR. So people don't always kind of realise that there are like issues with like transferring data in particular ways, and you've got to try and like get them engaged and interested to like follow these rules. It's really not, I mean, I find it interesting, it's also very important, but that's something that people often like, it's a bit abstract to them. And I think as well, like multitasking, just like client communication, sort of, I often ask people to like send me particular data and I'll say, oh, can you put it in a spreadsheet? But like what I think a good spreadsheet looks like and what somebody who never works with data thinks a good spreadsheet looks like are like not the same thing. So it's kind of like trying to explain to people why they need to sort of put things in like particular ways. Like it's kind of, it might be obvious to you, but it's not necessarily obvious to them. And it's kind of like bridging that sort of experience, knowledge, like expertise gap, I guess.
Anything to add, Kerry?
I think as well, one of the challenges can be presenting your findings to non-technical people, so people outside of your team or data science or data in general. I think that we use often a lot of terminology and jargon that perhaps doesn't translate well. So I think communication is such an important thing, and being able to highlight your findings and tell it as a story in a way that the people you're talking to get the most value out of it.
Yeah, it sounds, again, very familiar from like my industry days where, in fact, in academia now, I work in this thing called computational social science, and it's about sort of merging those computational and social science skills, obviously, as the name would imply. But to me, that sort of means you start it as like a social scientist and you say like, what's the human problem here? What can we fix? And you sort of bring it into your computational view where you abstract things and you make big assumptions. But then at the end, you can't just give them that box of assumptions. You have to sort of turn it back out into a narrative and say, oh yeah, because, you know, cars have a limited amount of fuel, we need to maximize these routes as they travel through the system and stuff. And, you know, the closer we get to that jargon Kerry's talking about, the more you lose those people and the more they don't care or the more they worry about automation. You know, it's really a narrative game, and especially that data analytics side, you know, all you can do with that data is tell a story and try and convince somebody that, okay, we need to change this system because we've looked at this thing and it implies this thing. And you can't just list all of these facts and expect something to change. You kind of have to lay it out on the table for those people. Cool. Next question, how did you first learn to code? Might be an easier one.
So my actual first experience of coding was a bit of a random one. So when I was doing my A-levels for, I'm not even sure which course it was, but one of the modules actually gave us programmable calculators, and I spent hours and hours programming it to solve a quadratic equation, and I was like really proud of it, and I took it into class and everyone was like, it's already got that function anyway, and I was like, mine's better. But I absolutely loved doing that, but I kind of like didn't recognize that as a calling until maybe like 3 years later, when in my bachelor's I did a placement, like a research placement in the summer, and my supervisor, he loved solving, or still does, loves solving paleontological problems using R statistics. So he kind of was the first person to teach me that, and I kind of just built it from there, really.
Nice. And did you, when they sort of taught you, did you go away and self-teach anything or use any courses, or was it just, you know, here's exactly what I need to do, I'm just going to Google it until that's solved?
So he gave me like examples and like a book that was like R for biologists or something like this. So he kind of showed me bits and like useful functions, but then I wrote the code, probably very, very messy, to like solve my own research questions. So I was already kind of excited and kind of learning independently, but in a sort of brute force way then. And then that kind of made me realise that I wanted to get into coding more, and that was why I chose the master's course that I did, because it was paleontology, but it has lots and lots of coding elements to it.
Kerry?
Yeah, I guess I already mentioned that, yeah, during my undergrad I did a project where I was running some code, but it was someone else's code. So that was kind of my first ever experience, and learning a bit of command line and having no clue and having to write them all down in a little book so that I knew which commands to run. And yeah, just trying to understand that. But I guess even before that, my first probably ever experience of coding in general was I had a MySpace page and like used to change the HTML to make it look really cool, and you know, that was probably my first ever experience. And then it wasn't until probably like 15 years later then actually learning a bit about, yeah, I guess C++, and then later just learning about web development and software development in general. that you kind of piece everything together, those small little elements, and yeah, it kind of, that I think, yeah, when I first learned Python, when I'd used a little bit within academia to create a few plots and stuff, but never to write my own functions or write my own code or anything. And that wasn't until I started my first job outside of academia, when I was writing a web scraper in Python. So to just go to a website to download some of the, I think that there was maybe a table on a website, and I wanted to extract all that data. And that's where it kind of all came together, because you have to look at the structure of the HTML. And I was like, oh, I kind of vaguely remember doing this years ago. And then using the Python code to actually scrape the website. So yeah, there were lots of different phases of me learning programming.
Liam?
So I always think of myself as really very lucky, because my undergraduate degree is in biology, and in the first year of that undergraduate degree they started us learning R, and that obviously was uncomfortable for a lot of people who'd never done any kind of programming before, and what they used with us was what I still recommend for people who are maybe feeling a little bit intimidated by jumping straight into programming, and they're maybe used to more kind of drop-down menu programs like SPSS. So they used with us kind of a layer called R Commander, which basically turns R into a graphic user interface drop-down menu program. But as you're selecting the different options, you can see how it's building the code for how you would write that command straight in a line. And that was really useful to kind of bridge that gap between user interface and starting to code, because eventually, as you've seen it do this more and more often, you realize, oh, it's actually a lot more quicker for me to just edit this code that I already have than to go through all these drop-down menus. So, it gives you an incentive. And this was, I should say this was well over a decade ago now, so there's probably better things than R Commander that exist out there as well. There's probably other things that do the same job.
There's a lot of good...
Sorry, Jane. No, I was going to say, so on a kind of similar note to what Liam was saying there, the software elements of it kind of clicked for me in my master's when I had a job, like a research task, to measure shells, and I was trying to do it all by hand with calipers, and it was driving me mad. And I was like, there's definitely a better way to do this. And there's this thing called ImageJ, which is like an image processing thing for like biological sciences. I think it was developed by like the National Institutes for Health or something. And you can write macros for this. So I built a macro sort of plug-in thing. It's on GitHub, and that was kind of learning that interaction between like GUI and automating things. That was a very different experience from just kind of scripting like plots, as Kerry kind of describes, which was kind of where I started with R. That was kind of opened the world, I think, working with a software like that.
I think it does unlock something where you can you see things and you just think, oh, it would be great if every time a YouTube video was uploaded, I could tweet that on this Twitter account. And it just kind of like changes that for me, where I go like, oh, I know I could do that in about 15 minutes. And it changes them from like, oh, it'll take me like potentially 1,000 hours to learn how to do this. But now it's just all these like little automation tasks, and sometimes they're easier than the manual options, it does seem like. So it is kind of a superpower as we get more and more techie as a society as well. Okay, another nasty sounding question. Is it true that the job market for data scientists is saturated, meaning there is a lot of competition among applicants? I don't know how much we can speak to this. Anything?
I think to add here that there's a lot of elements of data science in jobs that aren't just labeled as data science. So don't just narrow down your search and only look for roles that are data scientists. Like, as we mentioned before, there's data analyst, or like huge. I think my old job, when I applied to it, the title was data researcher. And that was a broad range of skills and wasn't just data science. There were different elements in that. But I think there are a lot of data science jobs, but don't just look within those. That probably doesn't even answer the question. But
no, it's a really good point. Like, it's so, as I said before, you know, people are really taking liberties with what data science is. But if you take the skills that a data science job has now, I'm sure it could apply for Liam's job. It could apply for Fiona and Kerry's job as well. Like, there is a lot of overlap there. And I think just by showing that you're someone that actually is interested in programming and data and telling stories, that's kind of all you really need. And the more you can showcase that you are interested in those things, whether that's personal, you know, Kaggle competitions that you've done or writing blog posts, you know, you're going to sort of stand apart in that way. But it's a sort of two-way street as well. If the companies are taking liberties with it, you can take liberties too. So I guess, as Kerry said, I would suggest, you know, don't just look for data science, look for data analysts, look for any sort of data researching positions. Obviously, there's like stats, there's like I can't remember what it's called, but there is like a statistical government entity that hires data science types.
ONS,
well. Maybe. What are they called?
Office for National Statistics.
Yeah, Office for National Statistics.
There's another one as well, but I can't remember. Like operational research is another one, or the jobs might have names like insight analyst or business intelligence.
Yeah.
Like, they're not always the keyword data either. Like, it's actually really amazing. Like, all these titles, like analyst is generally like a good one that covers, like, you'll get all sorts of like analyst jobs. Yeah, like, I mean, I couldn't comment like on the state of the market, but there are a lot of jobs out there at the moment, and I feel like it doesn't seem like there are loads of unemployed data scientists that like I've met. Like, sometimes it can take a while to find the right position, but I feel like I know lots of people who have jobs and are like moving to new jobs. Like, I feel like it doesn't feel like a stagnant market from my perspective, but obviously, like, I can't comment like overall.
Sure. I do often suggest as well, like, if you're struggling to find a data science or machine learning or deep learning role, but you want them, look for data analysts, because there are, you know, countless e-commerce sites have a data analyst position and often don't have an existing machine learning function. So you might find you're the only analyst that can actually code, and you might find that like opens some really crazy doors once you do get in. And I've had some positions where I've started as a web developer, and then they've realized that I'm the only person in the company that is happy to like manipulate data sets or can like forecast sales and stuff like that. And you can sort of really make these jobs your own because people are so excited to like get involved with it anyway. So as I said before, you know, data science is just a title. I personally think, you know, if you have that interest in data and telling stories, feel free to use the title and feel free to claim to have been one, because businesses are doing the same thing right now.
I think as well, just to add to, I guess, what my point was before, I think just check the job description more than anything, because again, it might be labeled as a data science job, but it might not have any elements of data science at all, and it might just be that the company think that's what a data scientist does. So I think, yeah, as Joe says, there's a lot of terms you can search for, and I guess, yeah, make the role your own.
Oh, next one is, do I need to be good at maths to work in data? I don't know if I'm expecting variation on the answers here. Let's see.
So I mean, I'll go first on this one because I'm in that kind of teaching role. I'm quite used to telling people that being good at maths is not the same thing as being good at statistics. So from my statistician perspective, I think of statistics and data scientists is a bit like reading a storybook. So it's about trying to understand what stories you can learn from a set of data. And the underlying maths that makes that up is a bit like the paper and the ink that makes up the book. You know, they need to be there, but most statisticians, data scientists are not interested in just looking at ink or just looking at paper. They're interested in reading, and they're interested in reading that story to find out what they can learn about the world around them. And I think it's quite a good metaphor to ask, you know, to ask yourself a career question of, well, what kind of technical depth actually captures your interest? Are you a reader who makes sense of the stories in data, or are you a writer who's interested in generating and regulating data, or are you even a bookbinder interested in new methods for how you put it all together? And my bet would be that probably most people will be the first type, but that's absolutely fine because every type of person is needed in that chain in the field. So really, I think that's a very long no. You don't need to be good at maths to work in data. It's much more about that kind of quantitative critical thinking that I mentioned before than the maths.
That's a beautiful answer, Liam. I wish I could steal that verbatim, but
feel free.
Got a recording, right?
Yeah, we got it. I'll link to that for a while, I think. Yeah, I will say, like, you know, obviously a lot of people now are doing masters in data science where they've not touched any maths since before GCSEs or GCSE level, and it's understandably hitting them like a brick wall when they get asked to do like 3 years of university maths in 1 year, and they can barely remember quadratic equations or straight lines or anything like that. I'll echo the similar sentiment. You know, if the maths will help you, but you can always go away and type, you know, run linear regression on this data. Where it will fail you not knowing it is when somebody doesn't believe you and you can't justify this is why this algorithm works, this is why it might have gone wrong. That's where the maths will come in handy, and it's very rare that you're going to be sat there, you know, hand writing out matrices and trying to figure out where something went wrong. It might happen, but it depends entirely on the work, and it's just, you're going to be in a better situation if you've got some of that understanding before you reach that point.
I mean, also it depends where you end up, but certainly in academia, if you're working on models that are complex in terms of the mathematics, and you reach that kind of barrier where you're not sure why something's gone wrong, chances are you will have a peer or a mentor or a colleague who does know that technical depth, who you can work alongside.
Yeah, like a kind of on the same sort of lines, really. I think basic principles that you get from maths, like logic, are really, really helpful. But I always imagine data science as like an application of mathematical techniques, and in a lot of cases, the tools that you need they already exist. Like, people make packages to do, you know, these complex mathematical things. It'll help you to. You want to know you're applying the right one, and that's where the maths kind of helps you. But chances are you're probably not going to be the one developing those methods from scratch. If you are, that's amazing because we need those people, but there's far less of those people than the ones actually applying these tools.
Yeah, cool. Very good stuff. I get that question all the time, so I'm glad to have some like nice answers to that I can link to. I've just seen a question in the chat that I don't think we've spoken about that I would love to speak about, and it's, is gaining a master's degree necessary for database roles? There's this huge divide between data science in industry expecting PhDs. Obviously in academia, it's a slightly different story where it is research focused, but there is sort of a leak out into industry that PhDs are needed for this data science work. So I don't know if you have any views on that, controversial or not.
I don't think it's necessary at all. I think that a lot of the skills you can develop yourself, and yeah, I think the masters are probably good as a maybe confidence booster in terms of giving you, like, you might do the course on your own and still think, oh, I'm not sure how I understood that because you've not been formally assessed maybe. I know that I feel like that sometimes. You might read around a subject and you feel like until you actually apply it, you're unsure how much you've understood, I guess. So yeah, maybe the masters might help in that sense in giving you that formalized learning environment, but I don't think it's necessary. I think that there's a lot of things that you can learn just online or through courses.
One thing I have started spotting, and I get loads of adverts for them, and I'm kind of jealous, is actually data science apprenticeships. Like, this wasn't a thing, but like more and more I keep getting, like, you know, emails sent to me, oh, there's these things going, like, I think it's kind of opening up. I think a lot of people who are in data science currently, because of the sort of weird technical skills that people often use in academia, and then people have left academia and come into industry, it makes it look like a place where you have to be really qualified. But it's more like, you know, if this field is like 5-10 years old, the only people who would be qualified are those who were already doing those things in industry and kind of in academia and kind of ended up in industry. But it's kind of evolving now, and, like, you know, you can do bachelors in it, And like, I think whatever way in kind of works for you. Like, I don't think there's any hard and fast rule on like levels of qualifications. Like, I know that my employer didn't ask to see my bachelor's or my master's degree. They took it from, can you do the skills for this job? And I hope it's kind of like that across the board, really.
Sounds like good sort of green flags to see in an employer. Like, I know for me, when I see the PhD requirement, it sort of says to me that it's a very research academic environment internally, and I always argue with it and don't really get very far, but I don't have a PhD, so it's easy to be on that side of the...
We can fight that one,
discussion.
Joe.
Yeah, we're working on it. Cool, I think we'll do the last question because we only got 5 minutes left. There is a huge data community. How helpful do you find meetups, blogging, podcasts, and Kaggle to your career? And then interestingly, an additional question, could it harm my prospects? So maybe some fear that it might make you look like you're not focused on your career if you're exploring other data things. I don't know. Any ideas? I know Fiona, you very recently joined the data industry, but I feel like you've struck the meetup scene by force. I keep seeing you everywhere.
Yeah, so I mean, I personally have only found it advantageous. So my friend at university actually mentioned that these groups exist. Like, that was the first place I'd ever heard of it. And when I came home from university, the first thing I did was, go on, things like Twitter, Meetup, Eventbrite, see what's out there and kind of get networking. Like, so I went out and just met loads of people, and like that's how I've ended up doing this event today, really. Like, I met both Kerry and Joe like just over a year ago when I first was like, yeah, I'm getting into data. Like, I think, could it harm your prospects? I don't really think so. I think you might not necessarily get a job if you've just done like 100 projects and like, but it's kind of not that simple. Like, I think unless you're like doing something really like breaking the law with it, I really don't think it's gonna do you any harm. And like, networking is always a great thing. It helps, give you more confidence, you find peers, it gives you like job opportunities. Yeah, I think if you take, say, a particular podcast or a particular blog and you read that as if that's the rules, then it might lead you astray, because obviously that's just like one person's opinion. So that's the only place I'd be careful with it, is like, because I read things sometimes on like Medium that are like, data science is over, and you're like, what's this scaremongering? And I think, I think it's good to read a variety of sources. Like, don't take any one thing as the truth. I think that's the only real danger, in my opinion.
Yeah, interestingly, that's like another, for me, I'd see it as a huge red flag if an interviewer ever said, you're doing too many side projects, or these are too many interesting things you're doing. I mean, if you're trying to hire a data scientist and you have someone who's actually curious and actually exploring things in their limited free time around a full-time job, I'd just be like, don't stop interviewing me now. And I don't think it has ever happened, and I don't know many people it ever has happened to, so it might be a fear from outside the industry itself. Oh, I don't have anything else. I mean, we've got 2 more minutes left. I'm going to share a feedback form in the YouTube chat, because that is how I measure my success at my work. So it would help me if anyone did fill that in. Amazingly, we thought we had about 60 signups. There must have been, I don't know if you can tell us, Liam, but there must have been about 180 or so people watching.
I think, yeah, certainly. We've had over 150, I think, any single one time.
Wow.
So yeah, thanks.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Well, we're getting the thank yous in now. So yeah, thank you very much for joining me today. That was a lot of fun, a lot more fun than it sounded like it was going to be. And hopefully a lot of people in the chat got some good advice and stuff there. And yeah, I'm on Twitter at JosephAllen1234. So if anyone does have any questions, although please don't all 100 of you send questions to my Twitter immediately after this. But yeah, if there is any more stuff, feel free to sort of tweet at me there, and we can try and sort of keep some conversations going as well. But if anyone has anything they want to plug or anything else, feel free to do so. I'll share the slides as well, which has all your Twitter details on.
I promise it's not sponsored content, but I'm reading this book at the moment called The Squiggly Career. So it's about like how, you know, the career ladder as such isn't necessarily a thing anymore, and kind of about finding your way, and, you know, moving sideways is really normal nowadays. I think I found it like reading a Guardian article, but I'm really enjoying it and find it really helpful. So I think for people who are kind of looking at starting their careers or changing careers, I think it might be a really helpful resource.
Cool. If we're doing, it's kind of fun to do a little round table of like, what would I recommend you read next? So for me, I don't have it to hand. So those kind of issues that I mentioned about thinking like a data scientist, a really good introductory resource for that is the book The Art of Statistics by David Spiegelhalter. So this is a very accessible, popular science book that digs into some of these issues that are really common about making inference from data, and it's really fascinating the way David talks about them.
Anything from you, Kerry?
Have
you got a book anywhere near you?
I don't, I'm afraid. No, sorry, no recommendations for me.
I will say I don't really read any like data related books. I do scratch that itch through sort of the meetup community and stuff. I think it's been really interesting how we've heard all these questions about like what could be a failure. You know, is Googling an answer while you're working as a failure, or is doing too many projects a failure and stuff like that. And I think that stuff will melt away as you get into the industry or into academia. You'll see that generally people are too much in their own heads to worry about that kind of stuff, so don't worry about it. But yeah, let's leave it there. Don't leave the Zoom in case we do want to debrief. But yeah, I think Liam, we're happy to end there.
Okay, yeah, great. Let's just thank everybody for joining us.
Thank you, everybody.